So can you introduce yourself and kind of tell me how you're like involved in climate education?
Sure. So my name is Jeremy Jacquot, and I am a teacher at the Nueva School. I teach chemistry and environmental science classes. At the moment, I'm teaching a climate change and action class, and been teaching that class now for a few years. And I kind of came to it just because, I thought there was a need to have more environmental education at our school. And so when the opportunity came for me to teach an elective class, I jumped at it.
Yeah. So what's your like personal favorite part of teaching climate education or just generally the general climate?
Yeah, I think my favorite part is getting students invested in stuff like solutions. And, there's a big policy component, right? So helping students understand what is the role of legislation, what is the role of people who work in the nonprofit sector to kind of make change happen. And I think given the current times we live in, I think having people understand what local actions are possible, who are the people they should talk to, how can they get involved is what I find to be most rewarding.
Yeah. So when you're in this space, are there any like common misconceptions, whether it's from your colleagues, your students, or whatever, that you would like most to change?
Yeah, I think the two most common misconceptions, the first one is probably that, young people like yourself can't really do much to take action until they're 18 or older, right? So until they're able to vote. I think that's a common misconception. But the reality is that there's a lot that younger people can do that doesn't involve just voting, right? So a good example is students attending city council meetings or doing stuff at the local level. So talking to city council people, getting other people interested in petitions, doing marches. So I think there's a lot of ways for people to be activists that don't look all the same, right? So if you're the type of person who likes to do go on a protest, do a march, you can do that. If you're interested in helping other people around you learn more about climate change and through that sway their opinions, you can do that. And then you can also, of course, do something at the legislative level. And then I think the second misconception is that people often think that the solutions to climate change are still ahead of us, right? Like we're still
Mm.
waiting for that magic bullet to come through. But the reality is that we have everything we need in terms of technology and in terms of resources. So some of those obviously will get better over time, like battery storage, so that we can better use renewable energy that is intermittent, like wind and solar. But we don't need to wait for some future advanced technology to make a lot of progress now.
Yeah. So like as an educator, how do you shift someone's view of like they can't do anything or that we're already doomed? And how do you shift that to like more hopeful and action-based approach?
Yeah, so I think, it's important to think about what successes have already been accomplished. And so I think that is often easier to do at the local level, right? So whether we're looking at cities in the Bay Area or cities around the US and around the world, right? So I think when it comes to the last few years with the Inflation Reduction Act, right, the big legislation that President Biden signed in, there were a lot of things that happened in terms of funding for renewable energy projects, people getting hired to have green jobs, right? Like building solar panels, and a lot of progress made with cities building bike lanes, greening more. So I think it helps to first see what the full spectrum is, right? So again, a climate action or a climate project doesn't have to be just solar panels. It doesn't have to mean something that is like reforesting trees. There are a lot of smaller ways that people can achieve successes that if you add them up, have a big impact. So I find that it's usually easier to get people motivated and energized when they A, see what things have worked that they could contribute to, and B, give them the means to immediately take action, right? So if you tell people, well, again, you have to wait until you're older, you can vote, or you have to wait until this thing happens, that's just going to mean you're pushing things, kicking the can down the road. So it's really about helping people find things that are attuned to their interests, right? Do something that you feel comfortable and are enjoying doing, and then seeing what has already been done that you can add on to.
Yeah, I think it's really important that like instead of looking at the big picture, you look at all the small details and then you like fix each one. I think it's a lot more, it's easier to get into that. So like in our current day, there's basically no centralized approach to climate education. So in your ideal world, in like say 5 to 10 years, how do you like to see it like a national climate education to look like?
So I think the key is to move away from having climate change or climate education be kind of its own class, right? Or having it be kind of feel like, in some cases, right, almost like tacked on, right? So having a few days in a bio class, a few days in a chemistry class, physics class, and have climate education sort of be part of the entire curriculum. So it would be great if, a history teacher, as an example, right, talks a little bit about the history of the climate strike movement, or having, of course, a science class could talk about the greenhouse effect. Maybe a English class, you read some climate fiction books, right, and you think about what are the big themes that different authors are entertaining, but it really needs to become something that kind of suffuses all disciplines, right? Because I think that way it feels more holistic, right? You're not just making climate education just the thing that only science teachers do. And the reality is that because climate change is part of our lives and touches on all different aspects, it also feels more authentic to kind of treat it as a set of concepts that should permeate every class, and obviously also ideally pre-K through 12th grade, right? So there are obviously certain things that when you get into 12th grade with students who've taken a lot of math, other advanced courses they could do that you couldn't necessarily do in a fifth grade class, but there's a lot you could build on. And again, I think for students to kind of see from an early age what it's about and really leaning on the solutions, hopeful thinking will make it something that people want to learn about and then also feel hopeful about taking on as a major challenge.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Instead of thinking it as just like a distant part of our world, but yet rather it's like it's part of our day to day. It's probably something important to think about. So more broadly in education, personally, how do you think students learn best?
Ah, so that's a big question. I think, well, obviously different students will learn in different ways, right? So I don't think there's a model that works for everyone. I do think, based on my, limited experience still as a teacher, that what really helps is for students to feel motivated, right? So for students to feel like they have some agency in what they're doing. So they have some choice, they get to select a topic or do something that they find rewarding, valuable, because having that motivation makes all the hard work that usually comes along with the project at least bearable, right? So if I were to assign a project to you that I control every aspect of, right? I just tell you, you're going to do this thing, you're going to have to learn 4 concepts to do it. You have 2 weeks, good luck. You're probably not going to be that motivated, or at least not as motivated as if I told you you have 2 weeks, you can pick the subject you want, but whatever it is you do, you need to make sure you can do these 4 things. So hopefully you pick a topic that you're like, ooh, I'm jazzed about this. I want to explore it. And yes, I have to learn a few hard topics to get there. But because I know that learning these topics is going to help me achieve the goal that I set out to achieve, right? This is something I value, then at least you're going to have, the persistence. You'll probably be willing to spend that extra half hour, maybe out of class, trying to make it work. But I do think that there's a mixture of, there's certain things that, especially if you're starting out in a class like, ninth grade chemistry, right? Most students in that class have maybe at most a year of chemistry, but most are still learning. So there's a lot of stuff you have to kind of learn to build up your base. And as you become more advanced in a class or in a subject, then you're more likely to know what you need to do, right? And you can have more autonomy. So I like to kind of move from like novice learners where you need a little bit more support, but can still do some stuff on your own, to getting to be an expert where at that point, you know how to learn things on your own. You have a good idea of the field, and then you can do a lot of stuff that you set out to do without too much help from the teacher.
Mhm. So again, in our current day with like the lack of responsibility by corporations and the government, how can students like try to fill in that gap?
Yeah, well, I think, a lot of it, especially when it comes to corporations, comes to pressure, right? So we're seeing, I mean, we've seen a lot of actions coordinated online, coordinated by groups of people, whether it's, boycotting certain companies that may or may not be supporting climate action. Well, may not in this case, right? So if you see a big company that is spending money on lobbyists to basically support fossil fuel use, then your wallet, even young people especially, right? Because a lot of companies try to cater to teen to young 20s because you all have the ability to make certain tastes happen and to get certain companies or products to be popular. So if you're like, you know what, we're not going to buy products from company X because they've done this or not done this, and then use TikTok, Instagram. I mean, of course, all the social media channels to get other people on board, that can have a big effect, right? Because companies, if their bottom line suffers, they're probably going to have to change. Um, and I think in the same way, right, using your influence as kind of leverage to talk to other people who may not know, right? So a lot of adults who are more clueless, let's say, right? I think having young people tell them, right, and have the way um, be more, let's just say, engaging in the ways in which they talk about these stories, right? Like storytelling, social media. But that can have a big impact. So a lot of coordination, a lot of meeting of the minds can have a big effect on these big entities, even if legislation, unfortunately, has not yet caught up to the task.
Yeah. So like really big problems like this, it's like it's easy to again feel like you have nothing to do. But what are you personally most excited to like see change or is it already changing?
Yeah, I think in terms of what I can see change, I mean, I hear a lot of people talk more about local stuff. And I mean, that was happening even before this past year, right? But I think people have realized now, after the Paris conference in 2015, and after, we've kind of been in this period of watching, like, are we going to be able to get emissions below a certain level so that temperatures don't rise above, 1.5 and then, quickly 2 degrees. And unfortunately, right, we've kind of seen that international big level agreements just don't work that well because they're not binding, because a country can say they're going to do this, and then 10 years later, they realize, oh crap, we actually can't do it because, so taking actions on your own with people in your community where you're more likely to see the effects, right? So if you decide that you're going to create a community garden where people are going to all contribute to planting crops that all of you can eat, right? You're all going to be planting, and you can, certainly plant crops that we know take up more CO2. That's great. Or you can all work on kind of greening a space, right? Turning what was a empty lot into a little community garden. There are all these ways that, again, may not address capital C climate change in the ways we think of, right? Like, is this going to absorb a whole bunch of CO2 emissions? No, but it does help. And again, the main thing is that it's something that people are doing together at a local level, and they don't have to worry about some big government entity preventing them, right? Or they don't have to get a bunch of red tape through. So I think that's encouraging, right? People realizing that there are ways in which they can make solving these problems their own and getting people on board.
Yeah, I think it's really important to keep in mind how like solving climate change is not like you have to sacrifice something, but rather it's more like mutual benefit. So like not only if by doing these things you're like helping reduce climate change, but you're also helping like every aspect of our world. Like if you build renewable energy, yes, you reduce emissions, but you also have more energy infrastructure for unrelated risk, which I think is very important. So let's say that in like 10 years we have pretty good climate education. How would you make it so, oh, this is a pretty difficult question to ask, but how do you make it so like once you're out of school, you're not like, oh, I learned this and I'm gonna get not use it. But how do you like make people like stay energized and focused on this area outside of the class?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. Because you're right. Once people leave the classroom, they'll specialize in a field that they've chosen they want to study. And so, I mean, obviously, thinking about science, right? There are a lot of people who take science. I mean, everybody takes science, but then if you're working in architecture, you're probably not using a lot of it, right? Um, So I think what really helps is to really, and again, the whole idea of like making climate education part of the entire education process, right? Kind of soup to nuts, like pre-K through 12. Almost thinking of it as associating it with kind of values, right? I think people who really value nature, who really think that protecting the environment is important because it brings them a lot of joy. They want to see that joy shared with their children, their grandchildren, but really making it that strong of a connection, right? People need to see that climate change is not just a problem that some other person can take care of, right? Like they can just do their thing, some other people will deal with it, right? It's all of us have a responsibility, and it doesn't mean that we have the most, right? Ultimately, companies obviously bear the biggest burden because they're the ones who are doing all the harm. But I don't think that's incompatible with people individually thinking about what can they do, right? And like you said, they don't have to sacrifice their livelihoods, right? They can still have very meaningful, rich lives that might actually be better because of what they do. Um, but that to me seems to be a powerful motivator, right? Is being in community with others, seeing these things that you can do as an individual, not as burdens, but as part of your daily life. So I think if we can pair that with having people, without having to read the news every week, right? They don't have to read about the latest climate change study and learn about this many emissions or that many emissions, because that doesn't, unfortunately, it doesn't move the needle, right? We know that all the science in the world at this point isn't going to push people who are adamantly opposed to climate action to change their ways. But seeing the benefits of climate action, of green jobs, of other improvements in their lives is going to be a much more powerful way to keep it an important piece of what they do.
Yeah, so that's all the questions I have, but is there any like one thing you would want somebody to like everybody in the world to know right now?
Um, I mean, I would say in a lot of areas right now, I think kind of what's most important is to try to figure out what's happening in your community, right? And not even just climate change. I think just becoming more involved, volunteering, is a really powerful way to feel like you can make change happen, right? It can bring a lot of satisfaction, a lot of joy. And I think even doing that, even if it's not climate change, just means that you're kind of getting in the mindset of giving back, and it just makes it easier then when, like you said, right, a lot of the things that are happening, there's a lot of community-based like microgrids, right, like which you talked about, ways that small communities can have their own solar panels, right, that they can draw on for their needs. They don't have to depend on a big utility controlling it. There's a lot of benefits to just kind of looking to the people around you, for all sorts of benefits. So I think that can then be a powerful motivator for you to maybe get involved with that local climate group, right? Maybe you decide, hey, that's something I want to do. And then from there, that might then take you into looking at running for local office or at least being more involved with your city council. So anything that kind of brings you into that sphere, I think is beneficial.
Yeah, building onto that, personally, I think something really important to keep in mind is like it's not about obviously it's about solving climate change, but it's also about like in the moment also we can solve homelessness, we can improve communities. I just think that's an important thing. Yeah.
Agree.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.